You've probably heard the saying, history is written by the victors. It's a simple way to explain why we remember the past the way we do. But what if it's more complicated than that? What if the version of history you learned in school wasn't just biased but deliberately shaped? We're told the Middle Ages were a dark age of ignorance, followed by a sudden, glorious Renaissance. But what if that narrative is a massive oversimplification? A story crafted to serve the powerful? What if two of the most powerful forces in history, the Church and the Crown, formed alliances that profoundly shaped the story of Western civilization? For centuries, we've inherited a historical narrative that was carefully constructed, a story shaped not just by victors, but by powerful institutions that understood a fundamental truth. If you control the past, you control the present, and have a map for the future. In this video, we're going to look behind the curtain of accepted history. We're going to explore how these powerful alliances worked, what historical events they influenced, and which truths got buried along the way. The real story is often deeper, darker, and more relevant to our modern world than you might think. This isn't just about what happened hundreds of years ago. It's about understanding who has been shaping the story all along. So, before we can get into specific events, we need to understand the engine that drove so much of medieval history. It wasn't just a single king or a lone pope. It was a system, a powerful and mutually beneficial pact between the two major institutions of the time, royalty and the church. On the surface, one governed the body, the other the soul. But behind the scenes, they often worked together in a way that made both of them far more powerful. This wasn't always a simple partnership. It was a complex synergy, built on a concept that could turn a man into something more: the divine right of kings. Think about what that really meant. The church, as the spiritual authority, could grant a monarch a legitimacy that no army could conquer. A king didn't just rule by force, he ruled because God had supposedly chosen him. His word wasn't just law, it was framed as divine will. Questioning the king wasn't just treason, it was heresy. In an instant, the crown was elevated beyond mortal criticism. So what did the church get in return for this powerful endorsement? A great deal. While kings got their mandate from heaven, the church solidified its power on earth. Monarchs, blessed by the clergy, became the church's protectors and enforcers. They defended the church's enormous landholdings, which eventually made the church the single largest landowner in Europe. They granted the church immunity from taxes, allowing it to gather wealth that rivaled kingdom. The church became more than a spiritual institution. It was an economic and political superpower, all thanks to the kings, who often owed their legitimacy to its blessing. This symbiotic relationship is powerfully symbolized by one man, Charlemagne, king of the Franks. On Christmas Day in the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned him Holy Roman Emperor. This wasn't just a coronation, it was a public declaration of this powerful alliance. Charlemagne is often remembered as a great unifier, a light after centuries of turmoil. But he also represents how this fusion of powers worked in practice. He understood that to unite a kingdom, he had to unite it under a single faith. His reign was one of relentless conquest, often carried out under the banner of Christianity. He became the ultimate symbol of how royal ambition and religious authority could merge into an unstoppable force. The blueprint was set. The church had its enforcer. The crown had its divine justification. And together they would reshape a continent. This blueprint of control needed to be put into practice. It had to be branded onto the soul of Europe, and a primary tool for that was conversion. But it wasn't always a peaceful process of missionaries sharing their faith. In many cases, it was a brutal campaign where faith was wielded like a weapon. Let's go back to Charlemagne and his infamous Saxon Wars. For more than 30 years, he waged war against the Saxon peoples of modern-day Germany. The official story frames this as a campaign to pacify a barbarian threat, but the truth is closer to a story of cultural erasure. The Saxons had their own rich, ancient culture and their own pagan faith. They didn't want Charlemagne's god or his laws, so Charlemagne gave them a choice that was no choice at all. Convert or die. This was policy enforced by the sword. Historical records like the Royal Frankish Annals are shockingly frank about it. In 782, at what's known as the Massacre of Verdun, Charlemagne ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon rebels for refusing to convert. 4,500 people killed in one day for religious defiance. He then issued laws called the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, which made pagan practices a capital offense. Refusing baptism, following traditional burial rites, or worshipping at sacred groves, all were punishable by death. Sacred symbols, like the Ermanzul pillar, were destroyed. The message was clear. Your history, your culture, your gods, they are being replaced with our narrative. The church provided the religious justification, and the crown provided the soldiers. But open war wasn't the only method. For kingdoms that couldn't be easily conquered, a more subtle tactic was used: the strategic royal marriage. On the surface, these looked like diplomatic moves for peace. In reality, they were often a way to convert a nation from the top down. Take the marriage of Clovis, king of the Franks, to the Catholic Princess Clotilda back in 493. Clovis was a pagan, but through Clotilda's influence and the promise of God's favor in battle, he converted to Catholicism. With his conversion, the entire Frankish kingdom was brought into the Catholic fold. The common people didn't get a vote. This set a pattern that was repeated across Europe for centuries. A pagan king would be offered a marriage to a Catholic princess, an alliance would be forged, and within a generation the kingdom's elite and its heirs would be loyal to Rome. It was a quiet conquest, where the bedchamber could be as important as the battlefield. And what about those who were already Christian but interpreted their faith differently? The alliance of church and state had a solution for that too: persecution, framed as rooting out heresy. In the Byzantine Empire, Emperor Justin I, a staunch Chalcedonian Christian, saw other Christian groups like the Arians not just as theologically wrong but as political threats. Using his imperial authority, he worked to crush dissent. Bishops with differing views were arrested and removed. In 523, an edict was issued that mandated severe persecution of Arians. This wasn't just about saving souls, it was about ensuring uniformity. A unified church meant a more easily controlled empire. Any alternative reading of scripture or history was a threat to the single monolithic narrative of power that both emperor and patriarch wanted to maintain. We've all seen the romantic version of the Crusades: chivalrous knights marching east on a divine mission to reclaim the Holy Land. It's a story of pure faith versus a foreign enemy. This narrative is one of the most successful pieces of historical framing ever created, because when you look past the religious zeal, you find a much more complicated picture. The Crusades were also a massive enterprise of conquest and power consolidation, driven by the complex motivations of both religious and secular leaders. Pope Urban II's call to crusade in 1095 was a brilliant political move. Europe was full of warring feudal lords. By creating a common external enemy, the Pope could redirect all that violent energy outward. He offered nobles a deal: fight for the church and you'll get remission of your sins, plus a chance at land and wealth in the East. It was a perfect outlet for a restless warrior class and a way to expand the influence of the papacy. Once the Crusaders established kingdoms in the Middle East, like the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the raw power dynamics became clear. This wasn't just about faith. It was about carving up the spoils. The alliance between church and crown was on full display, but it was filled with competition, with each side maneuvering for advantage. A shocking example of this is a man named Daimbert of Pisa. He arrived in the Holy Land not just as a bishop, but at the head of a Pisan fleet, a military force. Through clever politics, he got himself elected as the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem. But he wasn't satisfied with spiritual power. He immediately demanded that the secular ruler, Godfrey of Bouillon, hand over control of Jerusalem and the vital port city of Jaffa. He wasn't just asking. He was using his religious authority, backed by his fleet, to make a political power grab. The Holy Land was now real estate, and the Patriarch was acting like a rival king. The monarchs, in turn, were just as calculating. The kings of Jerusalem had the authority to arbitrarily take land from one noble family and give it to another who was more loyal. If a baron grew too powerful and built fortifications that could challenge the king could simply order them torn down. This was a ruthless chess game of control designed to centralize power in the hands of the king, who, of course, ruled with the church's blessing. And how was this story recorded? Almost exclusively by the victors. The chroniclers were often monks and clerks, sponsored by the very kings and popes whose actions they were describing. They had every reason to portray the Crusades as a glorious Christian quest and to downplay the greed, brutality, and cynical power grabs. The massacres, the backstabbing, the raw ambition. These parts of the story were often omitted or justified as righteous acts. The history we inherited is not an objective account. It's the carefully crafted public relations campaign of the enterprise. We're peeling back layers of a very old, very complicated story. If you're starting to see history in a new light, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. Because what we're about to discuss next shows how this alliance reacted during one of the greatest catastrophes in human history, and how crisis became an opportunity. You won't want to miss it. In the mid-14th century, the Black Death swept across Europe, wiping out an estimated 30 to 50% of the population. In this moment of absolute terror, people turned to the two pillars of their society, the church and the crown. They saw the plague as a divine punishment and looked to the church for spiritual comfort and to their rulers for order. What many found instead was that for the powerful, this apocalypse was also an opportunity for exploitation. As the plague raged, the demand for religious services, last rites, confessions, burials, skyrocketed. But priests were also dying at an alarming rate, creating a severe shortage. In some corners of the church, this crisis was met with corruption. Some local parishes and dioceses began dramatically hiking their fees for essential religious services. The price for a proper burial went up. The cost of a mass for the soul of a loved one became exorbitant. The sale of indulgences, which promised to reduce time in purgatory, became a booming business preying on a terrified population. This wasn't pastoral care. It was predatory opportunism. Of course, it's crucial to remember that countless priests and nuns bravely served the sick and died alongside their communities, but the widespread and visible corruption of others created a deep and bitter resentment. As people watched their families perish, while some parts of the church grew richer, the trust that had been built for centuries began to crack. Meanwhile, how did secular rulers respond? With the feudal system in chaos and entire noble families wiped out, vast tracts of land and titles were left vacant. Some ambitious kings and high-ranking lords seized the opportunity. They absorbed these vacant lands directly into their royal domains, confiscating the wealth and property of the dead. For the common person who survived, this often meant their local lord was replaced by a distant, impersonal royal agent. The power of the monarchy became more centralized and more authoritarian. This profound betrayal planted seeds of rebellion. The corruption seen during the plague became a major grievance for early reformers like John Wycliffe in England. He began to openly question the Pope's authority and the Church's wealth, arguing the Bible was the true source of authority. The Protestant Reformation didn't happen in a vacuum. Its roots lie deep in the collective trauma and anger born from the Black Death, a time when people looked to their leaders for help and too often found predators circling. The alliance between church and crown was a powerful tool for keeping friendly rulers in power. But what happened when a monarch became inconvenient, or when a new political movement offered the church a better deal? In those moments, the church could shift from a passive supporter to an active kingmaker, or kingbreaker. The power to grant legitimacy was also the power to take it away, and this was the ultimate tool for shaping history in real time. A fascinating example of this comes not from medieval Europe, but from the 19th century Empire of Brazil. For most of its history, the Brazilian monarchy and the Catholic Church coexisted under a system called the padroado, where the emperor had significant influence over the church. But as the century wore on, ideas like republicanism and secularism created tension. This boiled over in the 1870s during the religious question, a conflict where two bishops asserting the Pope's authority over the emperors were arrested by the monarchy. This act deeply alienated many clergy and devout Catholics. While this soured the official relationship, the story is even more complex. Some clergy, seeing the political winds changing, became active in the growing Republican movement. Figures like Father Uccio Pereira de Rocha used their pulpits and community influence to spread anti-monarchist sentiment, directly opposing both the monarchy and church authorities who sought compromise. They were acting as political operatives, choosing sides and manipulating public opinion. When the monarchy was finally overthrown in a military coup in 1889, the discontent sown by this conflict was a major factor. The institution that had once legitimized the throne had, through a mix of official alienation and the actions of radical individuals, become an agent of its demise. Afterward, the church quickly made peace with the new republic, showing its ultimate priority, preserving its own power and influence, no matter who was in charge. This pattern reveals that the church's support was often a strategic asset, granted or withdrawn to serve its institutional interests. By bestowing or revoking legitimacy, it could bolster a friendly king or weaken a troublesome one. By leveraging its vast network, it could shape public perception at the local level. This shows the church not as some otherworldly institution, but as what it often was, a pragmatic and powerful political player in the great game of power. So where does this journey through history leave us? We've seen a flexible blueprint for control used by powerful alliances in the Western world. We've seen faith used as a justification for conquest, as with Charlemagne and the Saxons. We've seen the Crusades unmasked as something far more complex than a simple holy war, filled with internal power struggles and greed. We've witnessed how the catastrophe of the Black Death was exploited, shaking people's faith in the institutions meant to protect them. And we've seen how these alliances were never permanent, with partners willing to break thrones when it served their interests. This isn't just a collection of historical facts, it's a pattern of how events, beliefs, and people can be influenced to consolidate power and control the official story. The simple narrative we're often told about our past, one of steady progress and divine will, is in many ways an illusion. It's the story the powerful wanted us to believe. But why does this ancient history matter to us now? It matters because the world we live in was built on these foundations. Many modern borders, laws, and even cultural conflicts have roots in these centuries-old power plays. The idea that certain institutions are too big to fail or exist above the law is an echo of the privileges this old alliance carved out for itself. The methods have changed, but the principle hasn't. The media we consume, the history taught in schools, the political narratives we hear, they are all shaped by powerful interests that benefit from a particular version of the truth. The old alliance of church and crown may have evolved into new partnerships between corporate power and the state, or media conglomerates and political parties. But the goal is often the same: to shape your perception of reality, to control the story. We've looked at the blueprint for how it was done. We've seen the mechanisms of control that have shaped our world. The real question isn't just about the past. If history was so effectively shaped back then, what makes us so sure it isn't being shaped right now? Question everything, dig deeper, never accept a single story as the whole truth. If you want to continue this journey and keep uncovering the histories they didn't want you to know, make sure you're subscribed with notifications turned on, and join the conversation in the comments below. What historical event do you think has been the most manipulated? Whose story isn't being told?